The night I boarded the Nightline Express 11 was the night I unknowingly stepped out of the world. I knew, and into something far darker, far colder, and far more patient than death itself. Because from the moment I walked onto the nearly abandoned platform, I felt a strange pressure crawling beneath my skin, a silent warning that something was watching me from the shadows above the tracks, following me with a slow curiosity, as if it had waited years for someone like me to finally show. Oop. The station lights flickered overhead with a sickly yellow pulse that made the air look stained, and although it was late, the silence around me felt too deliberate, too intentional, as though the night itself was holding its breath in anticipation. And even when a gust of sharp wind cut through the station, I didn't feel relief, but instead felt something colder riding the current, brushing the back of my neck like a fingertip drawing an invisible line, guiding me toward the arriving train, whose headlights cut through the darkness in a pale, ghostly glow. The Nightline Express slowed with a metallic sigh that echoed through the empty station, and for a moment I hesitated, gripping my suitcase tightly, because something inside my chest whispered that once I boarded, I wouldn't come back the same if. I came back at all, but I stepped forward anyway, unable to tell if it was curiosity, exhaustion, or something unseen nudging me forward toward the opening doors, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop so sharply that my teeth nearly chattered. The stale air brushing my face with the scent of old metal and forgotten memories. And as I walked deeper into the coach, I realized something was horribly wrong because the entire train was empty. It's not just quiet empty or late-night empty, but unnaturally empty, like a place that hadn't been touched by human presence in years. Yet everything was perfectly clean, perfectly arranged, as though someone had prepared it specifically for me. I sat down near the window, trying to steady my breathing, but outside the glass was nothing, no platform, number tracks, no city lights, just a thick, ink-like darkness pressed against the window, as though the world beyond had been swallowed whole. And when the train jerked forward and began moving, the lights flickered violently, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw a figure reflected beside me, a tall shadow sitting inches away. But when the lights came back, the seat was empty, though the lingering cold told me something had been there. The air grew heavier with every passing second, almost suffocating. And when I finally gathered the courage to walk down the aisle, trying to find a conductor or any sign of life, I noticed a handbag and coat neatly placed on a seat, items that were warm to the touch, as though their owners had been there moments before. And as I touched the coat, a deep, dragging sound echoed through the coach from the far end, slow and wet, like something heavy being pulled across the floor with deliberate patience. And my heart slammed against my ribs as the lights dimmed again, revealing glimpses of unnatural shapes stretching along the floor before snapping back into darkness. So I rushed to the next compartment, only to step into pitch blackness, where the smell of damp metal clung to my throat. And when my foot hit something soft, I nearly screamed until I realized it was a duffel bag, whose contents a notebook, clothes, and a photograph made my stomach drop, because the photograph showed 6 people smiling in front of this exact train, yet behind them, in the reflection of the window, stood the same faceless shadow that had appeared beside me earlier, watching me with an unnatural fascination. I backed away, trembling, and the moment a cold whisper breathed, "Don't leave," against my ear, I stumbled into the next coach, where I froze in horror because every seat was filled with unmoving passengers, dressed exactly like those in the photo, their bodies unnaturally stiff, their faces blank and drained of life, staring ahead without breathing until, in a moment that shattered whatever strength I had left, the nearest passenger turned her head toward me in a slow grinding motion, her eyes empty, yet aware, and as her lips parted to reveal a hollow, unnatural smile stretching far too wide, I understood that I hadn't boarded a train meant to take me anywhere. I had boarded a train that had been waiting, hungry, and I was the only passenger still alive enough to understand the truth. And before I could react, the woman's head twisted slightly more, her neck bending with a brittle, crackling sound like dry branches snapping under pressure. And though her eyes were empty, there was something behind them, something ancient and starving, studying me with a fascination that made my blood turn cold, and as I stepped backward, her hand rose in a slow mechanical motion, as if pulled by invisible strings. Her index finger pointing toward the dark corridor behind me, where the dragging sound from earlier grew louder, closer, and more deliberate, echoing like a beast crawling through a tunnel. Panic surged through my veins, urging me to run, but every exit looked the same, every corridor stretched impossibly long, as if the train had folded in on itself to form a maze designed to keep me moving in circles, and the overhead lights flickered. Again, revealing for a split second that the once empty seats were now filled with even more passengers, all of them turning their heads toward me at unnatural angles, their smiles carved too deeply, as if sliced into their skin by something inhuman, and I felt the walls of the coach tightening around me with each flicker, the air thickening with a moldy scent that clung to my lungs. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape their gazes, and burst into the next compartment, only to find it filled with fog, dense and icy, swirling in slow spirals as if alive, whispering against my ears with fragmented voices overlapping in agonism, begging for help, others warning me to run, and a few whispering my name with unsettling familiarity, though I had told no one I was traveling tonight, which made me realize, with dread, that whatever was on this train knew me long before I stepped. Aboard. The fog parted slightly, revealing a long mirror running along the wall, and when I approached it cautiously, my reflection wavered like ripples on disturbed water, still shifting into distorted versions of myself, one with hollow eyes, another with blood dripping from my nose, another with a noose around my neck, each version staring back with a silent accusation that felt like a prophecy rather than a reflection. And suddenly, the mirror shattered inward, sending razor-sharp shards flying past me, embedding into the opposite wall like they were thrown intentionally, and behind the broken frame, instead of a metal panel, there was a pitch-black void that pulsed like a living heartbeat, expanding and contracting as faint whispers poured out from its depths. I backed away slowly, but the floor beneath me vibrated as if something massive was crawling under the train, its weight bending the metal, its movements slow and assured, and dust drifted from the ceiling as screws loosened from the panels. Falling at my feet like warning signs, I sprinted toward the next door, but it slid open before I could touch it, as though the train itself guided me forward, herding me deeper into its belly, and I entered a dimly lit coach where the lights hummed with a strange rhythmic pattern, flickering in a sequence that almost resembled Morse code, except the message felt directed at me, its pulses syncopated with my heartbeat, manipulating my breaths, making my chest tighten as though hands were squeezing my lungs. Suddenly, the lights dimmed enough to reveal blurred silhouettes sitting in the seats, their features indistinct, as if erased or smudged out of reality, and when I squinted, their shapes glitched slightly, like corrupted images struggling to stay coherent, their bodies twitching in silent spasms, heads snapping at unnatural angles every few seconds, and the longer I stared, the more their forms dissolved into static drifts, their outlines fizzing like broken video signals. One of them abruptly stood, its movement jerky and fragmented, stepping toward me despite having no face, no eyes, no mouth, only a smooth blank surface that reflected the faint light in a sickening way, and as it approached, its chest split, open vertically with a wet tearing sound, revealing rows of sharp teeth lining a gaping cavity where a heart should be, and a low guttural growl reverberated from within it, vibrating through the floor and rattling my bones. I stumbled backward, slamming into the door behind me, but instead of opening, it pulsed like warm flesh, trapping me inside. And the faceless creature stopped inches away from me, its jawline chest opening wider as if preparing to swallow me whole, but then a metallic screech echoed through the coach, causing it to convulse violently and collapse into a pile of black dust that evaporated near my feet. Shaken and gasping, I turned toward the source of the screech and saw a dark figure standing at the far end of the compartment. Tall and still, its presence radiating a cold dread that sank into my bones, and though I couldn't see its face, through the darkness, I felt its gaze piercing into me, heavy and deliberate, as if it had been waiting for this moment. and in a voice that didn't echo through the air but instead vibrated inside my mind, it whispered, "You should not be here," sending a jolt of terror down my spine as the train shook violently, plunging me deeper into its nightmare. The shaking grew so intense that I had to brace my hand against the wall, but even the metal beneath my palm felt disturbingly soft, pulsing faintly like muscle instead of steel, as though the entire train had stopped being a machine and begun transforming into something alive, something breathing, something aware of my presence, and reacting to my fear with a hunger that made the air taste metallic. The dark figure at the end of the compartment stepped forward without making a single sound, its movements impossibly smooth, like it floated rather than walked. And with each step the lights above flickered violently, causing bursts of static to ripple across the walls as if reality itself glitched around it, and although no wind passed through the coach, its long coat swayed gently, as though stirred by an invisible current that wrapped around the creature alone. I backed away, desperate to put distance between us, but the aisle seemed to stretch longer with every step I took, elongating unnaturally so that the doors behind me drifted farther and farther away, mocking my attempt to escape, and the sickening realization struck me that the train was manipulating space, bending it like clay so I could never reach an exit before it decided to let me. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I realized the figure was no longer walking. Now it was suddenly closer, drastically closer, less than 5 feet away. Though I hadn't seen it move at all, and the moment I blinked, it was right in front of me, its face still hidden in shadow as if darkness clung to it like a second skin, refusing to let the light reveal whatever horrors lay beneath. My body froze against my will as the figure leaned in slightly, and though it had no visible eyes, I felt it staring through my skull, peeling back layers of memory and emotion with the ease of someone flipping through pages of a familiar book, and an icy whisper seeped into my mind, speaking words I didn't understand but felt deep in my bones, words that stirred buried fears I had spent my whole life trying to forget. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head, as if listening to something behind me, and when I forced myself to turn, I saw the rows of seats in the coach twisting violently, reshaping into jagged protrusions like rib bones emerging from beneath torn skin, and the shadows between them thickened until they formed human-like shapes. No, it's not human, but silhouettes made of darkness alone, dozens of them rising from the seats like awakened spirits, their limbs stretching unnaturally long, their necks bending upward to reveal hollow gaps where faces should have been. They began to move toward me in synchronized steps, their bodies shifting with an eerie, liquid smoothness. And the sound they made, soft clicking, like nails tapping glass, echoed through the compartment at an accelerating rhythm that pounded against my skull. Panic exploded through me, and I lunged sideways, pushing into the narrow space between seats, hoping to slip past them. But the moment my shoulder brushed the wall, the surface rippled like disturbed water before countless pale hands burst through. It, gripping my arms, my shirt, my neck, pulling with unnatural strength as whispers poured from the cracks, begging me to stay, to join them, their fingers cold as ice yet burning my skin like dry ice pressed against flesh. I screamed and thrashed desperately, managing to pull myself free just as one of the shadow figures slammed its elongated arm down where my head had been a second earlier, the impact denting the floor with a force that told me my skull would have shattered instantly if it had connected. Stumbling onto the aisle, I sprinted with everything I had toward the door at the far end of the compartment. And this time, either out of mercy or sadistic amusement, the door slid open just before I crashed into it, sending me tumbling into the next coach, where I landed on a cold metallic floor that felt mercifully solid. Though my relief vanished instantly when I looked up and saw that this compartment wasn't a passenger coach at all, but some kind of maintenance area filled with pipes, flickering screens, and thick cables that pulsed faintly like veins carrying something other than electricity. The screens along the wall flickered to life one by one, displaying grainy black and white footage of the train's interior. And to my horror, I saw myself on every screen, but not just me as I was now. Some screens showed me sitting calmly, unaware of the horrors I was experiencing, while others showed me screaming, banging on doors that didn't open, and worst of all, one screen showed me lying motionless on the floor with hollow black sockets. Where my eyes should have been, my mouth stretched open in a silent, frozen scream that made bile rise in my throat. I stumbled backward, bumping into a tall metal locker that suddenly rattled violently, as if something inside had been startled awake. And the vibrations grew more aggressive until the entire door bulged outward, dents forming quickly as though fists or something far stronger were pounding from the inside, trying to break free. Terror surged through me and I spun around, looking for another exit. And that's when I saw a panel on the far wall, labeled Conductor's Office. Its small window dark and impossible to see through, yet something about it pulled me forward, a slight warmth radiating from the cracks around the frame that felt strangely alive compared to the freezing gloom of the rest of the train. As I approached, the door unlocked by itself with a sharp metallic click, and a slow creak announced its opening, revealing a narrow room bathed in dim red emergency light. With old maps and control levers scattered across a console that buzzed with faint static, the air inside the room felt different, thicker, heavier, almost charged with an energy that raised the hairs on my arms. And as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into an oppressive silence broken only by the faint hum of a radio device sitting crookedly on the table, its speaker crackling with static like someone was trying to tune a distant signal. I reached for it with shaking hands, praying that someone was out there. Anyone who wasn't part of the nightmare unfolding around me. But before I could touch it, the radio crackled violently, and a voice whispered through the static. Trembling, desperate, terrified, if you're hearing this, it's already watching you. Don't trust what looks like you. Don't. And the message cut off abruptly, replaced by a deep guttural growl that vibrated through the room. It made the lights flicker as a cold breath crawled across the back of my neck. My entire body froze as that cold breath lingered on my skin, slow and deliberate, and although every instinct screamed not to turn around, not to acknowledge whatever stood inches behind me, some deeper, primal part of my mind whispered that it was already too late, that the thing had chosen me the moment I stepped onto the platform. So I turned my head slowly, painfully, expecting to meet the hollow face of another shadow creature, but there was nothing. Only the dim red glow of the conductor's room and the hollow quiet humming like a heartbeat. And yet the undeniable presence remained, pressing against my shoulders like invisible hands resting there with intimate ownership. I backed toward the console, my trembling fingers brushing the cold metal levers and scattered papers, my eyes darting across the room for anything that made sense. And then I saw it, a small leather notebook partially hidden beneath the edge of the table, its surface worn and cracked, as if handled by someone desperate, someone who clung to it like a lifeline. And though I hesitated, something compelled me to pick it up. The moment my fingers touched the cover, a sharp jolt shot up my arm like an electrical shock, and the room dimmed slightly, as if the train itself reacted to my discovery, its metal exterior groaning in a low, hostile warning. But I forced myself to open the notebook, flipping through pages filled with frantic handwriting, cryptic notes, and drawings so disturbing my stomach tightened sketches of faceless figures, twisted passengers, and a monstrous shadow wrapped around the train like a serpent feeding on the souls trapped inside. The last few pages were different, written with trembling hands, smeared by sweat or tears, and they repeated a single, chilling message: the train chooses who to keep. My pulse hammered in my ears as I read further. Some doors lead forward. Some lead back. Others lead nowhere at all. The train bends reality. Don't trust your eyes. Don't follow the shadows. Don't listen to the voices that sound like you. And then the final line, underlined so violently that the pen tore through the page. If you reach the engine room, don't look directly at the conductor. I didn't understand any of it, but dread curled around my spine as though the train wanted me to stop reading, wanted to keep me blind and wandering until it swallowed me like the others. Suddenly, the lights in the tiny office blinked out with a loud pop, plunging me into total darkness, and a slow scraping sound rose from the floor. Like long nails dragging across metal, circling me with predatory patience in every muscle. In my body tensed as the unseen thing moved closer and closer, its presence suffocating, its intent unmistakable till the emergency lights flickered weakly back to life, revealing something that made my heart nearly stop. A version of myself crouched in the corner of the small room, exactly my height, my face, my clothes, but twisted slightly wrong, its shoulders slumped unnaturally, its head tilted too far to the left, and its eyes pitch black like deep tar pools reflecting no light whatsoever. My doppelganger slowly lifted its head, and I watched in horror as a smile slashed across its face, too wide, too sharp, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that no human mouth could ever contain, and in a voice that was almost my own but layered with something hollow and echoing, it whispered, "You don't belong here." But I do. The thing stood in one fluid motion, its movements smooth and predatory, and as it stepped toward me, the walls of the conductor's room began to pulse, beating like a heart, faster, louder, until the floor vibrated beneath us. I backed away until my spine hit the console, but there was nowhere left to go. And the doppelganger leaned forward, its face inches from mine, its breath cold and rancid as it whispered, "I've waited so long to wear you before its hand." Reached toward my throat, fingers elongating unnaturally like dripping shadows. I ducked instinctively, grabbing the nearest object, rusted metal Levant, swung it blindly. The impact landing with a sickening crack that sent the creature staggering backward, its form glitching like corrupted footage, flickering in and out of existence as it let out a distorted screech. Without thinking, I lunged for the door, slamming my shoulder into it until it burst open, and I tumbled back into the maintenance compartment, gasping for air as the door behind me slammed shut on its own, with a resounding clang that echoed down the corridor. The train groaned angrily as though my escape had wounded it, and the lights overhead flickered violently, throwing the space into a stuttering nightmare of shadows and light as pipes shook and sparks rained down from frayed cables. I pushed myself to my feet, chest burning with fear, and sprinted down the narrow corridor toward the next door, every step pounding with the certainty that the doppelganger would tear the door open behind me at any second. But before I could reach the end, an ear-splitting alarm blared through the train, the walls shaking as a distorted voice echoed through ancient speakers. "Unauthorized passenger in restricted section. Correction in progress." The words repeated again and again, each repetition more warped, more inhuman, until the voice sounded like multiple creatures speaking in unison. And the floor beneath me began to shift, pulling apart as mechanical claws emerged from hidden panels, scraping toward my ankles like hungry metal hands trying to drag me down. I leaped forward, barely dodging the snapping claws, and crashed into the next doorway, slamming my hand against the panel until it opened. And I stumbled into the next coach, bracing myself for whatever new nightmare awaited me. But what I saw instead made me freeze completely, because sitting in the center of the compartment was a little girl, no older than 8, wearing a faded blue dress stained with something dark, her small legs swinging off the edge of a seat as she hummed a soft, broken lullaby that echoed hauntingly through the silent coach. And when she slowly lifted her head to look at me, her eyes were not empty or hollow like the others. They were filled with sorrow, deep and endless, as she whispered, "You shouldn't run. It follows faster when you run." Her small voice carried a weight that didn't belong to a child, a trembling truth that seeped into my bones and made my heartbeat stutter. But I forced myself to take a cautious step forward, every instinct telling me to keep quiet in the presence of something that didn't fully belong to the living. The girl's fingers nervously twisted the frayed hem of her dress, and though she watched me with sorrow, her expression held no fear, as if she had seen every horror this train hid, and fear had long since abandoned her. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the darkness behind me, and whatever she saw there made her shoulders tense, her breath hitching slightly before she whispered again, more urgently this time, "Please don't move so fast. It wakes the walls." Confused and terrified, I knelt slightly so I could see her face better. But the moment I moved, the entire coach groaned, the ceiling flexing subtly as though responding to my shift in weight. And the little girl's expression hardened with warning as she shook her head sharply. I froze, barely breathing, watching as her small hand rose shakily, pointing toward the narrow aisle behind her where a long, deep crack had appeared in the floor, splitting open, slowly like a widening mouth, darkness swirling inside it like thick smoke, pulsing in slow waves that looked disturbingly alive. The girl slid off the seat with delicate, careful movements, walking toward me with ghost-like silence. And as she reached my side, she whispered, "It's choosing a way to reach you," before gently tugging my sleeve to pull me farther from the crack. As we moved, something shifted inside the gap, a massive shape pressing against the edges from below, causing the metal floor to bow upward as though a creature the size of a car was crawling beneath the surface. Following our steps with predatory precision, and the low rumble that vibrated through the compartment told me one horrifying truth. Whatever lived under the train wasn't bound by metal, it was fused with it, part of it, controlling it, sensing every vibration, every breath, every heartbeat. The girl pulled me behind a row of seats just as the floor split open completely. An explosion of snapping metal and rotting air erupting upward in a violent burst that sent fragments of flooring skittering across the compartment. And from the darkness below risen a twisted mass of tendrils made of both shadow and metal, writhing like serpents, their tips tipped with unnaturally sharp points that dripped a black, viscous liquid onto the seats, burning through the fabric with a sizzling hiss. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming as one tendril slithered across the aisle, stopping inches from where I had knelt moments earlier. Rising like a cobra tasting the air, searching for the scent of Firan before I could. "Stop it!" My pulse spiked with panic, loud and frantic, and the tendrils snapped sharply toward the sound, striking the side of his seat with enough force to bend steel, sending sparks exploding outward. The girl grabbed my wrist with surprising strength for her tiny frame and whispered urgently, "It hears your heart, don't think loud," as though fear itself was something that could echo across the train and give away my position. Mass of tendrils retracted with a horrible, wet scraping sound, slipping into the darkness of the crack as the floor began slowly repairing itself, metal stretching back into shape like living flesh, knitting shut in the moment the last inch. Sealed, an unnatural stillness consumed the compartment, to still like the air before an earthquake. I looked down at the girl, confused and desperate for answers. But she only stared at the now-healed floor with hollow resignation before whispering, "It can't come fully yet. Not until the train decides you can't leave," and her words sank into my mind like ice water, chilling every thought because it meant the train hadn't chosen to kill Met, was testing me, learning me, adjusting itself around me like a predator studying prey before the final strike. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice as I asked her who she was, hoping she might be the key to understanding this nightmare. But she didn't answer at first, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the coach where another door waited, its glass window covered in a thick smear of something dark that pulsed faintly under the dim light. After a long silence, she whispered, "My name was Emily," her voice cracking slightly on the past tense, and when she looked up at me again, the sorrow in her eyes was so deep it felt centuries old. She clutched her small hands together and continued, "I boarded this train a long time ago, but not long enough to forget, not long enough to escape." And her expression tightened with pain as she said the word escape. Like she'd tried many times, and each failure carved another wound in her soul. I asked her softly how long she had been here, but instead of answering, she moved toward the smeared door, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the dark substance, tracing its surface with a familiarity that told me she'd passed through this door more times than she could bear. Suddenly, she whispered, "Before we go, you need to know something," her small voice shaking for the first time. "When the train likes someone, it shows them things. It shows them versions of itself that aren't real, versions of you that aren't real. If you trust the wrong you, it takes your place." And as she said it, I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me as I remembered the doppelganger in the conductor's room, how it moved like a broken reflection, how it whispered with my nearly perfect voice, how it wanted to wear me like a suit. Emily breathed deeply, steadying herself before turning toward the door and adding, "But there's something worse than the copies. The rooms that lead nowhere. If you step into one, you never come out. You walk forever until you forget why. You were walking, and before I could question her further, the lights flickered violently as a deafening metallic roar tore through the train, making the seats rattle and the walls bulge inward as if something massive was slamming into the earth. Exterior from the outside door, from inside the metal. Emily's eyes widened with raw fear, and she grabbed my arm tightly, whispering, "It's close. We have to move now," before pulling me toward the smeared door. Her small hand trembling in mine as the roar echoed again, louder, angrier, shaking the foundation of the train as though the creature beneath the floor was rising, climbing, choosing the next place to break through. Emily's fingers tightened around my wrist as the entire coach groaned, like the bones of some ancient beast awakening from centuries of slumber. And for a brief, horrifying moment, the ceiling bowed downward, as if something enormous pressed. From above, dragging its weight along the length of the train, hunting, listening, choosing, Emily pulled me toward the smeared door with frantic urgency. But as we approached, the dark substance coating the glass began to move slowly at first, then pulsing in jagged, unnatural patterns like veins carrying corrupted blood before, stretching across the surface to form crude shapes resembling hands pressing from the opposite side, each one smearing trails across the glass as if the people trapped in that other compartment were clawing frantically, begging to be let out. A chill wrapped around my spine when I realized the smears weren't just stains, they were handprints, hundreds of them, overlapping in frantic desperation. Some small like children's, others large and distorted as though twisted by pain or decay. Emily hesitated, her small shoulders trembling as if passing through this door took a toll on her every time, and she whispered, "Don't touch the glass. The ones trapped inside will pull you through," before reaching for the old metal latch beneath the window. The latch creaked loudly, far too loud in the suffocating quiet, and the train responded instantly. The lights surged with violent brightness, then snapped back into darkness, except for faint red emergency glows flickering like dying embers. And beneath the floor, the monstrous rumbling grew louder, closer, shifting like a massive serpent coiling beneath thin metal skin. With a shaking breath, Emily yanked the latch upward, and the smeared door swung open with a sickening suction sound, as if unsticking from something wet, and a blast of frigid air hit us, carrying with it the stench of rust, old water, and something far more disturbing, something like decaying flesh soaked in ice. She tugged me inside before the door's grotesque handprints could react. And the moment we crossed the threshold, the door slammed behind us with a clang that reverberated like a bell tolling for the dead. We found ourselves in a narrow corridor that felt dramatically different from the previous coaches. Not a passenger compartment, but a transitional section, its walls lined with old pipes dripping a dark liquid that hissed as it hit the metal floor, leaving behind thin trails of smoke. Flickering blue lights cast jittery shadows that shifted unnaturally, stretching and bending like living silhouettes, and the air felt heavier here, almost thick enough to taste, filled with metallic bitterness that clung to my tongue. Didn't speak at first, but her grip on my hand tightened as she led me deeper into the corridor. Her steps slow and deliberate, avoiding certain tiles as if she'd memorized which ones were safe and which ones hid dangers beneath. As we moved, I heard whispers, soft, indistinct, echoing through the pipes overhead, like voices trapped inside them, calling out for help, begging to be freed, crying, pleading, screaming, then fading to faint whimpers that vibrated through the metal-like dying breaths. I wanted to cover my ears, but Emily shook her head without looking at me and whispered, "They can sense fear through sound too. Don't let them hear you panic," which only made my terror intensify, threatening to break free from the fragile control I clung to. Halfway down the corridor, a sudden metallic bang erupted behind us, followed by the screech of claws dragging across steel long. Deep gouges that stretched across the door we had just passed through, and Emily spun toward me with wide, terrified eyes, whispering, "It found this passage." It never found this passage before, and for a split second, she looked less like a ghost and more like a terrified child caught in a nightmare she'd been forced to relive endlessly. We rushed forward, but the corridor twisted unnaturally, bending left, then right, then splitting into two identical paths, even though the train itself shouldn't have been large enough to contain such branching tunnels. And Emily froze, staring at both corridors with trembling uncertainty. I whispered, barely audible, "Which one?" But she didn't answer immediately, her eyes flickering with panic as she whispered, "It changes the paths." "It doesn't." "Want us to reach the quiet room?" And the way she said quiet room made my stomach twist with dread, as if even naming it angered the train. Before we could decide, the wall behind us pulsed violently as a massive bulge pressed outward, stretching the metal like thin rubber before splitting open with a deafening tear, revealing a grotesque mass of black sinew and metallic shards writhing. Like a living organism, dozens of elongated limbs slithering from the wound with sharp tips scraping against the floor, sparks flying as they dug into the steel like knives. Emily screamed not loudly, but sharply, and grabbed my hand, pulling me down the left corridor as the creature surged into the passage behind us, its limbs slamming against the walls with thunderous force, scraping metal into twisted curls. As the pipe-wrapped walls ruptured, spilling out dark fluid that splashed against the creature's limbs, sizzling like acid yet seeming to strengthen it, making it move faster. The corridor bent sharply, and I nearly slipped as the train lurched sideways, tilting violently as though something massive had rammed into its side, the gravity shifting enough to throw us against the left wall before slamming us back onto the floor. I struggled to stand, but Emily yanked me upward with surprising strength, urging me onward as she whispered through gritted teeth, "Don't stop it. It reaches you, it copies you, and then you're gone." And the image of the doppelganger flashed through my mind again, its jagged smile, its hungry eyes, its whispered promise to wear me like skin, fueling my desperate sprint. The corridor finally opened into a small circular chamber with a single flickering light overhead.
Ow.
And in the center stood an old rusted elevator door with peeling paint and a broken panel that sparked weakly. Emily rushed to the panel, slamming her small fist against the down button repeatedly as tears welled in her eyes, while behind us the creature's limbs scraped closer, its guttural growls vibrating through the floor as it dragged its massive body toward the chamber, the walls trembling as though the train itself feared its approach. The elevator doors shook but didn't open, and Emily screamed, "Please, please, just once open," pounding the panel until blood smeared across her knuckles. And the creature's shadow fell across the chamber entrance, stretching long and distorted as one of its limbs slithered in, curling across the floor like a serpent tasting the air for prey. I grabbed Emily, shielding her with my body as the creature lunged, but at that exact moment, the elevator doors screeched open just enough for us to slip inside, and we tumbled through the narrow gap as I slammed my foot against the closing door, forcing it shut just as the creature's limbs smashed into it with monstrous force, denting the steel inward with a single blow and sending the entire elevator vibrating violently as Emily sobbed against my chest, whispering, "It's not supposed to find us here. It's not supposed to find anyone here." The elevator shuddered violently as another impact slammed into the outside, bending the dented metal inward like soft clay. And for a moment I was certain the creature would tear through the doors and drag us back into the nightmare of twisting limbs and metallic flesh. But then suddenly the elevator lurched downward with a stomach-churning drop as if the cables had been cut. Emily screamed and clung to me as we plummeted, the walls rattling so violently that flakes of rust showered down like dirty snow, and the flickering bulb overhead swung wildly, casting distorted shadows that jittered across the cramped walls, crawling over Emily's trembling face, over my shaking hands, over the dent that still throbbed inward from the creature's blow. The elevator sped downward faster and faster until the pressure pressed against my chest, crushing the air from my lungs. And just as my ears popped painfully, everything stopped, not gradually, but instantly, violently, with a jolt so sudden. It slammed us both to the floor, knocking the breath out of me in a single brutal impact. The elevator lights flickered off for several seconds, leaving us in suffocating darkness where only our uneven breaths echoed off the cramped walls, and in that darkness, I felt the horrible sensation that something else had joined us. Something quiet, something watching, something breathing only when we breathed. Emily whimpered softly, pressing her face into my shoulder as she whispered, "It followed us in the dark. Don't move. Don't let it know you're listening." And her words froze my blood because she spoke not with fear, but with certainty. The certainty of someone who'd survived this exact moment before someone would learn the pattern of a predator that hunted in silence. For several agonizing seconds, the darkness thickened around us like a living fog. Almost warm, almost wet, and then a faint scraping sound appeared in the far corner of the elevator. Slow and deliberate, like a fingernail dragging across metal, millimeter by millimeter. My throat tightened as I held my breath, terrified the sound of it would draw the thing closer. And Emily's small hand found mine in the dark, squeezing with desperate strength as she trembled uncontrollably. The scraping grew louder, then softer, then suddenly multiplied 2 scrapes, then 3, and then 6. Since so it sounded like dozens of small hands were dragging themselves up the elevator walls, scaling toward the ceiling, tapping, feeling, searching. A faint breath brushed my cheek, a humid exhale that carried the stench of mildew and rotting fabric. And I fought the instinct to recoil, knowing even a twitch would betray us. Then, just as suddenly as the sounds had begun, a faint mechanical hum stirred beneath us. Then the elevator's dim emergency light flickered weakly back to life, revealing with sickening relief that the cramped space was empty, no creature. No shadow, no twisted limbs, but Emily pressed a shaking finger to her lips before I could speak. Her wide, terrified eyes fixed on the ceiling above us where a long, narrow crack had formed in the metal, leaking a single line of thick black fluid that dripped onto the floor with a soft hiss. The elevator dinged quietly, the doors sliding open with a reluctant groan, revealing a pitch-black hallway stretching into darkness, lit only by faint blue emergency strips lining the lower walls like the glow of distant ghost lights.
Emily
Tugged me forward urgently, whispering, "We don't stay still too long." It's always listening for stillness. And the cryptic warning hung in my mind as we stepped cautiously into the hallway, the elevator doors closing behind us with a metallic click that echoed like a final heartbeat. The hallway felt colder than any part of the train so far, an unnatural cold that seeped into my bones, numbing my fingers and making my breath appear in trembling white clouds as we walked. And the walls here were different, tribbed with vertical metal slats that pulsed faintly, like the deep breathing of a gigantic beast hidden beneath its own skin. As we continued forward, small vibrations trembled beneath our feet, growing stronger with each step, like footsteps, but not ours, scoing from somewhere deep below, heavy, steady, getting closer. My heart hammered painfully as I whispered, "Where does this hallway lead?" But Emily didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead as she replied to the quiet room. "If the train doesn't change it before we reach it," and the way she said quiet made every hair stand on end, as though the name itself was a warning. The hallway suddenly trembled violently, the slats on the walls rippling like disturbed water, and a low moan echoed through the corridor, not a human moan, but the sound of metal bending under immense strain, like the train was turning its attention toward us, adjusting itself, choosing a new path for us to walk. Emily froze, her eyes shifting rapidly back and forth, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. And then she whispered, "It's changing. It knows we're close. Hurry," pulling me forward into a sprint that sent our footsteps echoing down the corridor like thunder. As we ran, the emergency strips flickered erratically, some of them popping out entirely, leaving sections of the floor in complete darkness, and behind us, the wall slats burst outward in violent jerks, as dark tendrils shot through them, reaching for our ankles like skeletal fingers dragging across the ground. I leaped over one tendril, narrowly avoiding its grasp, while Emily darted ahead with supernatural swiftness, her small figure illuminated by the faint blue glow as she shouted, "Don't let them touch your shadows." At first the warning made no sense until I noticed that the tendrils weren't grabbing our bodies. They were reaching for the stretched silhouettes cast on the floor, latching onto them with sickening wet sucking sounds. One tendril caught the very edge of my shadow, and a jolt of freezing pain shot up my leg as if the limb itself had been pierced. The agony so sudden it buckled my knee, sending me crashing hard against the cold floor. Emily screamed my name, my real name, though I had never told her, and rushed back toward me, even as the tendril tightened around my shadow, pulling, dragging, trying to yank me backward, toward the writhing wall. I clawed at the floor, my fingers scraping raw as I struggled against the invisible force. The cold tearing through my leg like shards of ice spreading through my veins. And just when I felt my strength slipping, Emily kicked the writhing tendril, with a small glowing object clutched in her hand. An old silver pendant that burned with faint white light, and the tendril recoiled violently, shrieking as it burst into a cloud of black ash. She grabbed my arm, hauling me to my feet with unexpected power, whispering urgently, "Your shadow is still yours. Don't lose it again," and the strange warning sliced through me with confusion and terror as we resumed sprinting through the trembling hallway. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the corridor widened abruptly into a massive circular chamber bathed in soft white luminescence, the first gentle light I had seen since boarding the train, and Emily collapsed to her knees in relief, whispering, "We made it." The quiet room. We made it, but something in her voice carried a heaviness, a tremor. As if arriving here wasn't salvation only, a temporary reprieve from the horrors hunting us. Yet the moment my foot crossed the threshold of the quiet room, the soft, white light revealed its true nature, not comforting, not warm, but sterile in a way that stripped the world of color, muting everything into shades of pale gray, as though life itself had been drained from the air. The circular chamber was enormous, far larger than the dimensions of the train should allow, with walls lined by seamless, smooth metal that seemed to dampen sound, swallowing even the faintest echo of our breaths until the silence became oppressive, an almost physical pressure against my ears, and I instinctively reached out to touch the nearest wall, only for Emily to grab my wrist with sudden force, whispering, "Don't." It remembers every touch, and her eyes wide, haunted, glistening, held such raw fear that I pulled back immediately, the skin of my hand tingling as though it had brushed something unseen. We moved cautiously toward the center of the room, where a circular indentation in the floor pulsed faintly with dim white light, almost like a heartbeat, slow and steady, and as we approached it, Emily's breathing quickened, her fingers gripping the pendant at her throat like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Then, without warning, a deep vibration rolled through the chamber, causing the smooth walls to shimmer like liquid metal, and ghostly silhouettes began to fade into view, hundreds of them faint outlines of passengers frozen in various postures of fear, their translucent faces stretched in silent screams, their hands pressed against the walls as if trapped within the metal itself. My stomach twisted violently as recognition flashed across my mind. These were the missing people, the ones the world assumed had vanished into the night without a trace. But in truth, they had been swallowed whole by the train, absorbed into its structure like memories trapped inside a living machine. Emily tugged my sleeve gently, guiding my gaze toward a single shadow figure near the far wall, taller, darker, more distinct than the others, as it slowly turned its head toward us. Though it had no features, no eyes, no mouth, only an impression of a face that strained outward from the metal surface, as if trying to break free. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears, growing louder and sharper until it felt like needles were being driven into my skull. And Emily clutched her head, whispering through clenched teeth, "It hates movement. It wants us still. Don't give it what it wants." But my legs trembled uncontrollably as the figure pushed further out of the wall, its head stretching into the room like a shadow peeling away from a surface, forming a long, jagged silhouette that extended toward us. Then the circular indentation in the floor flared with sudden bright lights, so bright it washed the shadows away, and the figure snapped back into the wall, treating like a creature burned by a sudden flame, though no flame was present, only that pulsing white glow. Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand straighter as she whispered, "The quiet room is a checkpoint, a place the train can't fully control, but it listens. It always listens, and as her words drifted through the suffocating silence, the floor beneath us trembled again, this time more gently, almost like the faint shiver of anticipation. And she tugged at my hand, pulling me toward the center of the glowing circle. As we stepped onto it, the light shifted, swirling beneath our feet like ripples in a pool, forming symbols I didn't recognize. Strange, angular shapes that rearranged themselves faster than my eyes could follow, and then the chamber changed. Subtly at first, then violently, as the smooth walls rippled outward, like a living organism responding to a sudden intrusion. The ghostly figures twisted and distorted, their forms melting into the metal until only faint stains remained and the air grew colder. So cold my breath crystallized instantly, drifting upward as a thin plume of frost. A soft whisper echoed around the circular room, not from Emily. Not from me, but from the walls themselves, layered voices merging in a whispering chorus. Speaking in a language that sounded like fragments of memories, repeating phrases half lost to time. He boarded alone. She never left. They were chosen. The last passenger will decide. The disjointed words overlapping until they dissolved into static that made my teeth ache. Emily squeezed my hand, grounding me as she whispered, "It's testing you. The quiet room always tests the ones it wants," and I turned to her in confusion, the pulsing symbols beneath our feet reflecting in her wide eyes. But before I could speak, the entire chamber plunged into darkness, heavier and denser than anything I had ever experienced. So complete that even the memory of light seemed to vanish, and all that remained was the quiet, breathing of the walls, like the slow inhale and exhale of an enormous creature waiting to judge us. Then, one by one, tiny lights appeared around the edges of the circle, dim at first, like dying embers, then growing brighter, stretching upward into thin vertical beams that encircled us like bars of pale fire, and within those beams the shadows reformed, not as trapped passengers frozen in fear, but as moving figures, reflections of people walking, running, falling, screaming, as though the room was showing us memories of every soul the train had ever consumed. Among them, one shadow caught my lone figure with my height, my build, my posture running through a corridor that looked eerily familiar, chased by something enormous and formless. And I felt a sick realization twist inside me as the figure stumbled, fell, and was swallowed by darkness. Emily saw it too, her face tightening with a kind of sorrow I didn't understand, and she whispered, "This is what it wants you to see, what it wants you to remember, what it wants you to become." And though her words made no sense, the room itself reacted to them, the beams of light flickering violently as the shadows writhed in protest. Suddenly, the symbols beneath us flared again, this time with deep crimson light. And the voice no longer whispering, but speaking clearly echoed through the chamber in a tone that vibrated in my bones, "The last passenger is not ready." The words struck like a physical blow, sending me staggering backward as the light surged upward, gulfing us in a blinding flash that made my eyes burn and filled my lungs with icy air. Then everything shifted suddenly, violently, sickeningly. The quiet room expelled us like unwanted intruders, hurling us backward through a spiraling tunnel of white and shadow, until the ground vanished beneath my feet and the world dissolved into weightless chaos. The engine coughed again as the taxi rolled deeper into the abandoned industrial road. I felt that same pressure in my chest that had been haunting me since the night I'd picked up the last passenger. A pressure that felt like invisible hands, tightening every time I remembered his face. If that face was even human, and as the headlights flickered over the rusting containers and broken street lamps, I kept telling myself that everything I had seen since yesterday was just stress, lack of sleep, hallucination, but the radio crackled again with that same whisper that wasn't on any station. A voice repeating my name slowly as if tasting each syllable, stretching it like elastic, and when I hit the brakes, the taxi jerked forward,
"Ow,"
throwing me against the steering wheel right as a dark silhouette crossed the road. Not walking but drifting, its feet never touching the ground. And for a second, I thought it might be a trick of the light until the shape turned its head toward me. revealing those hollow sockets I had seen in my mirror last night when the passenger disappeared from the back seat. And a cold wave washed over my spine as the thing lifted its hand and pointed toward the passenger seat, where the leather was still indented, as if someone had been sitting there moments ago. I wanted to reverse, to escape, but the gear wouldn't move, frozen like the entire car had been locked by some unseen force. And then the whisper from the radio deepened into a layered growl, a chorus of voices overlapping male, female, child. Something else all telling me the same thing. You brought him back. And the silhouette outside began to multiply into 3, then 5, then dozens of shadowy forms surrounding the car, pressing their hands against the windows, leaving smoky fingerprints that evaporated into the air, while the temperature inside the taxi plummeted so fast my breath turned into fog. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, trying to wake myself from what felt like a nightmare. But the shadows outside merged together into a massive shape towering above the car, its body stretching across the sky like a living storm cloud. And when it leaned down the road, buckled under its weight, sending cracks spreading like veins across the pavement. And before I could scream, the passenger door swung open by itself with a long, slow creak, revealing a figure sitting in dais. Inside, the same man from last night, the one who vanished, his clothes now torn, his skin pale as bone, and his eyes reflecting no light, just endless blackness as he leaned closer and whispered, "You didn't drop me home. You dropped me into him," pointing toward the colossal shadow outside. And every nerve in my body ignited as he continued, "Now he wants a replacement," and before I could react, his hand shot forward and grabbed my wrist with a strength that felt like steel cables, pulling me toward him as the car doors locked shut, the windows fogged over completely, and the world outside disappeared into swirling darkness that pressed against the glass like a living ocean. The taxi shaking violently as if something enormous was lifting it off the ground. My heart beat thundering in my ears, while the voice on the radio hissed one final word that chilled me worse than everything else combined. Run, but there was nowhere left to run. Nowhere left to hide. Only the feeling of being swallowed by something older than death, older than memory, older than the night itself. The taxi spun through the suffocating blackness as if the world had been erased and replaced with a void that breathed, pulsing around me like a living heartbeat, and as the shadow passenger tightened his grip on my wrist, dragging me closer into that freezing darkness, I felt my memories slipping, my name, my home, the sound of real street, everything dissolving as if I was being unmade. But then, for the first time since this nightmare began, I noticed something. A faint glow behind the passenger's hollow eyes, like a tiny spark fighting to stay alive. And the colossal shadow outside the one he called him paused, its enormous shape shuddering as if something inside it resisted. The passenger's voice, no longer deep and demonic but soft, almost human, whispered, "I didn't want this. I never wanted to be his." And suddenly the darkness around us rippled like disturbed water, the shadows screaming in silent agony as cracks of dim, grayish light tore through the void, and in that split second I realized the passenger was not the monster. He was another victim, trapped like me, used as bait, and he was trying to stop the ritual from completing. He shoved me backward with a strength fueled by desperation, shouting, when the door opened, "Run. Don't look back." And before I could protest, the taxi slammed onto solid ground as the void shattered like glass, flinging me against the door, which burst open on its own with a violent hiss. And cold night air rushed in as the world snapped back into existence, the abandoned road, the decaying factories, the yellow flicker of a street lamp, everything exactly where it should be, except the taxi was now sinking into a whirlpool of shadows forming beneath it. A collapsing tower of smoke, its long arms grabbing the passenger and pulling him downward as he screamed, not in fear, but in relief, yelling, "Go. He can't follow you in the light." And every instinct in me screamed to save him, to grab him, to not leave him behind. But the asphalt under my feet suddenly cracked open, tendrils of black reaching for my ankles, so I stumbled forward, falling, crawling, running as fast as my legs allowed, not daring to look back, as the road behind me roared with a sound like thunder mixed with 100 voices crying out at once. I sprinted until my lungs burned, until the shadows stopped chasing, till silence returned like a heavy blanket, and when I finally collapsed near the edge of town, the first rays of dawn broke across the sky, washing everything in a soft orange glow that felt unreal after the night I endured, and as sunlight hit my skin, the last echoes of the whispers vanished completely. Later, when authorities found the abandoned taxi half buried in the cracked road, they questioned me endlessly, but no explanation I gave could be believed, so I stopped trying, choosing instead to live with the memory of that passenger who sacrificed himself so I could escape. And sometimes, late at night when the streets are empty and the engine hums quietly beneath my hands, I glance into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there again. But all I ever see is the faint impression of someone who once sat behind me, a reminder burned into the leather seat. And though the world thinks I'm safe now, the radio sometimes crackles with distant static, a soft whisper I pretend not to hear, because I know if I acknowledge it, if I answer, the shadows will remember my name, and the passenger who never reached home might return to finish the journey he died trying to escape. But until that night comes, I keep driving under the streetlights, praying the darkness never calls for me again.